My name is Average Joe.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky.
Hey, how are you? My name is Ben, and I am a movie buff.
My name is Asian John.
My name is Pixel Patch.
And my name is Dr. What, and I'm a total nerd, but you wouldn't know it if you met me.
And I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
I am one part video game nerd, one part comic book nerd, but all parts movie nerd.
And I am at best a casual fan, but I do love learning. I know very little about nerd culture, and I'm on a journey to learn and troll people along the way.
I'm a joyful geek with an expertise in gaming, both tabletop and video.
My expertise is in mathematics, history, of course medicine, and all things nerddom.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, TV, manga, comic books, or is that graphic novels, cartoons, groups, that's animation, Disney, Star Wars, Dragon Ball Z, Pokemon, and Digimon, and Mighty Morphin, Power Rangers, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Yu-Gi-Oh, and Nintendo, Cinematic Universes, when the newest nerdy news drops, these Cloudhouse pals put it under the scope, DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, Cinematic Multiverses, manga, Christmas, strangest franchise, hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where for the final time, we are going to be putting nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
I was trying to think of a good segue into a Final Frontier joke when you said for the final time, but I wasn't able to.
That's a Star Trek thing, right?
Yeah, look at you. You're becoming more and more an expert on all things geek and nerdy, just in time to finish the podcast.
I don't know if that was ever the goal. I think if anything, one thing I've definitely learned over the years, like I'm very happy in my lane. Like it's been enjoyable to like explore different arenas, different franchises, different things, but
that's still got to be a byproduct, right? You know, you've been doing this long enough. There must have been a lot of things that are like, oh, I did not know that. You know, even if you didn't join the fandom altogether, you know, we got you to play D&D partially because of the podcast.
Yep, you're absolutely right. That is very true. All to say, yes, it's been about over a month since we had our last episode. I was very intentional in not committing to a specific release timeline for the final episode. Our big hope was to get all of the people who have been co-hosts of the podcast in one conversation. But that involves a lot of children's sleep schedules and 3 different time zones. Yeah, for the final time, Ben the Movie Buff. Here you are.
Hey, how are you? Here I am. It is pretty crazy to be back. I was trying to think about the last time I did a podcast with you guys, and it might have been 2020 when we were all in lockdown. And it's been way too long, but I'm so glad to be here for the final episode.
So episode 300, I think we made a joke at least once that we should talk about the movie 300 during
I feel like at
300.
some point we were considering it.
Yeah, I think I might have even gone as so far to like say on air we were going to watch 300 because it's a movie I still haven't seen. I've seen the sequel, Rise of the Empire or whatever, with the blue capes.
Yeah.
But I have not watched the entirety of the original 300.
Oh, wow.
I'm assuming you have, though, Ben the Movie Buff.
Yes, I own 300 on Blu-ray. I actually got a cool Blu-ray book that was at Canadian Tire, of all places, a couple of years ago, because they have sometimes the bargain bins of movies, and I found that. I'm like, this looks cool. And in addition to being a fan of the movie, I picked it up, and I really enjoy the movie. And I saw it in theaters when it came out first as well.
So that would have been Zack Snyder's first comic book movie.
Correct. Yeah.
Because he did Watchmen after that.
Yes, that's right.
And then they gave him the keys to Man of Steel.
Mm-hmm.
it seems like from what I've seen of 300, there's a lot of slow mo. Like, is that where his like love of slow mo starts, or was that like in his other projects as well?
So, from what I remember, because I'm also a fan of his Dawn of the Dead remake from 2004, there is some slow mo in that, but I don't think there's as much. Like in 300, we definitely get a lot of examples of speed ramping, where they're moving at regular speed, and then someone gets stabbed, and then they take a moment to kind of emphasize that in slow motion, and then they really quickly go back to normal speed, and then they go into slow motion. So, I think 300 was definitely the one where it was pretty evident that he liked that style.
As I recall, too, he used to direct music videos, right?
Yes, I think
I
so.
didn't make
Yeah.
that up, right? And my wife's a film student. Mjolnir, I'm pretty sure, told me that, and I feel like in 300 it was more obvious that I think that's where it comes from, because there is a lot of music happening during those scenes. Like
Hmm.
it is like the score of the movie really adds to the atmosphere for 300. I think more so than
Yeah.
some, and I think better than in Watchmen. Um, but it also kind of highlights that it is kind of music video-ish in its cutting and in its editing, especially during the fight scenes.
Yep.
At this point, I'm like, I feel like it was at the time it was pretty famous for like some scenes that became like memes and stuff, like getting the guy getting kicked into the pit and like
Yep.
the
Oh
amount
man,
of
there was
like
an entire video with a remix song about it that had all the memes posted back in the day. I loved it. I used to listen to it while studying in high school.
oh, I feel like I was too young at the time when it came out to watch it. Is it worth watching now?
It's been a while since I've seen it, but I would like to think by the Blu-ray that is still in my film collection, I would say give it a watch, especially if you've seen the kind of underwhelming sequel. I think it's definitely worth just kind of seeing, like where what preceded that sequel. And I'd like to think if I were to put it on tomorrow evening and watch it again, I would still enjoy it.
I feel like it's not a classic masterpiece, but a lot of it holds up still, and a lot of
Mm.
especially a lot of the scenes, a lot of the editing, um, still like it's a very well put together movie. Um, I think, and you also get to see where some of the memes came from and some of the things that were a little more patchwork in it, but I think don't go into it being too analytical. It's not one of those movies where it works very well to do that, but otherwise, I think it's still worth a watch. Yeah.
All right, so just so that we can say we've talked about 300 in the 300th episode, how many bat cookies would you give this movie?
It's out of 4, right?
Out of
Average
4.
Joe? Out of 4?
I'm surprised for the amount of movies you've reviewed on this podcast. You always ask about how many bat cookies it
Do
is.
I? That's so funny. Yeah, I think it's because I'm used to different. Because I know like Letterboxd, I think is out of 5. IMDb is out of 10. So I'd give it 3 out of 4 bat cookies.
Yeah, I was gonna say 3 or 3.1, depending on. I think 3 to 3.1, depending on how I'm feeling that day.
Mhm.
Because I do think 300 also is one of those movies that like is much better when you're in the mood for watching it.
Okay, well there you go, guys. There's your conversation about 300.
Ta-da!
Instead of making the entire episode about the movie 300, Tater Tot had the idea of, is someone like doing dishes?
No, sorry,
Beeper's been outed. Tater Tot had the idea of using the final episode to kind of like reflect and to share our experiences of the podcast. So this is going to be very nostalgic, and for people who maybe have started listening to the podcast recently and are, I don't know, at all disappointed the show is ending, we will keep all the episodes online for a few months, but we will eventually stop paying for the hosting services, which means that it'll disappear from Apple and Google and all the podcast platforms. And if you really want to listen to the episodes, you could email batcharpodcast@gmail.com and ask for like the MP3 files. But that's if you really want to listen to the podcast.
But what we're saying is download it right now and jack up our numbers while we're still on the internet.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, you could also just download them, because I imagine by by November, we'll probably have shut the hosting off. So yeah, go and download all the episodes you want now.
And if there's enough downloads, then Average Joe promises he'll not.
No,
I'm kidding. I'm not going to make promises on your behalf.
Yeah.
No. Now, I feel like the story of how this podcast was started has been told several times. So I'm gonna Beeper, let's test your knowledge. Do you recall how the Batch Hour podcast got started?
You were sick and tired of having people ask you the same questions over and over again, and so decided to have a podcast where you would answer those questions, and then you could just refer people to the podcast if they asked you those questions again. Like, slight TLDR, but that's pretty much how it started.
Yes, that was definitely part of it in the year of our Lord 2016 when this podcast started. I remember that was the year that Captain America Civil War came out and Tom Holland made his first appearance as Spider-Man. And I remember coworkers like coming up to me being visibly confused. They're like, okay, I saw this trailer, but Spider-Man was in it and he was with the Avengers. How is that possible? Like there was just a Spider-Man movie like a few years ago with a different guy, and having to explain the reality of the Sony Marvel relationship. Those kinds of things often happened for me. Ben, the movie buff, do you recall any of the history beyond what Beeper said?
Yeah, I was trying to think about that earlier, and I think one part that I might have remembered was that, in addition to what Beeper said, that I think you were talking to John Hiddleston or Hiddleston about, I guess, maybe nerdy or geeky topics. And I think the idea was possibly born of the fact that I think you were a bit more knowledgeable than John was. And part of the approach was that when you guys started the podcast, that you would kind of be the one talking about these things, uh, um, knowing a bit more about it, and John would kind of have the outsider perspective and kind of looking in and slowly trying to learn about these things. So I think that was a bit of the approach. But correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're giving away Asian John's real name, but it's the
Oh,
last episode.
shoot. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry
It's
if I
the
shouldn't be
last
doing that.
episode. I'm pretty sure everyone knows who we are.
Okay. Yeah.
No surprises.
I gave away his identity. Darn it.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. That was a huge part of the podcast. Asian John and I were roommates at the
Yep.
time.
Right.
And I would watch my nerdy stuff on our TV, and he would come in and ask random questions. And because he grew up in Western Asia and wasn't exposed to a lot of the nerdy and geeky media that I was, hearing him as a man and an adult man talking about this stuff and seeing it for the first time, it was such an interesting lens to. I was like, because I was introduced to like Dragon Ball Z as a child, it was so interesting to hear somebody like trying to understand it as a 30 something watching it for the first time. Like, so there's this show and these guys yell at each other, and I was like, and I found that some of the conversations we were having just in our apartment, I'm like, this would make for interesting content. And it just sort of worked that he was working in, or rather, he owned the equipment we would need to record a podcast. I had been challenged through a leadership training on finding a way to kind of channel my creative energies into like a project, and that kind of led to me, yeah, what if I started a podcast? This was, of course, fall 2016, long before. I feel like when the pandemic started, everyone started doing podcasting.
Or podcasts that already exist started getting more popular too. Like it kind of, there was a few things in there.
So I don't want to be all hipster, but it's like we were doing it first.
Oh, you were doing it. Is true though that like podcasts used to be this like very niche thing, and it's like, oh, I know a guy who does a podcast. Like, oh, really? That's interesting. I mean, not that the Bad Jar podcast is any less interesting today than it was in 2016, but I definitely think it has more competition in the world.
Oh yeah. And if I ever go if I ever go back to podcasting after this, I'm definitely going to pick a more specific topic or theme for the podcast, because this is so broad. There's so many podcasts that talk about this kind of stuff. And the only thing we have unique about our show has been our own perspectives and our own opinions, which everyone's got opinions.
Yeah. But like you said, you had started off with a different dynamic, right? With something that was a bit more out of the ordinary. Like, there are still other podcasts like that. And like, Mjolnir listens to one where it's, this guy watching JoJo's Bizarre Adventure for the first time with a bunch of his friends who have watched it before. And it's great. But I feel like it was pretty unique, and it still is. Like, there aren't that many where it's like subjecting your friend to your fandom.
Yeah, there's one podcast I found called Gilmore Girls Z, and it was this couple where every podcast episode they would discuss an episode of Gilmore Girls that the male had watched for the first time, and an episode of Dragon Ball Z that the female had watched for the first time. So they're like subjecting each other to their to their interests and talking about it.
Too bad they didn't do it with Supernatural, but that would have been a little. Just because Jared Padalecki is in both.
Yes. There's too much. That's too much Jared Padalecki. The other thing that was inspiring me to run a podcast was that I was really big into podcasts. I gave up YouTube for Lent one year
and just replaced it with podcasts.
Yeah, it was a loophole for sure. I was working a job where I was listening to a lot of stuff, watching YouTube videos at work. Don't tell anybody. And so it was so bad. I'm like, I need to give this up for Lent. And so you could argue, was I really fasting from it, the type of media, by just switching over to podcasts? But what I found listening to podcasts, especially this podcast called The Weekly Planet, which is still, it's been going on for 10 years. It's in the top 50 podcasts on Apple Podcasts. These Australian guys talking about pop culture. I don't understand why it's so popular, but it is. And I found listening to their podcast, I'd see the episode titles, be like, oh, I can't wait to hear them talk about this. Are they going to mention this thing or that thing? And not to pick on them, but often they would not mention details that I was aware of. And I'd be yelling at my car, you forgot this. How could you forget that? And so I think the early days of the Batchar podcast, I was really adamant to not forgetting any details. I'm I'm going to be that guy who says everything.
I feel like our episode. Can you imagine if we were keeping to that when we did our One Piece episode? I do remember, because that was the first episode I was on. I remember actively restraining myself from talking for much longer because I knew that the Batjar podcast you had told me, was about an hour at most, and I was like, oh, okay, this is gonna take a bit of a backseat right now, but I don't know. But you had that goal, and yet in the early days you used to cover 2 or 3 things per episode.
Yeah, I think one of our milestone episodes was the top 5 best and worst episodes of the podcast, and yeah, I think we tried to talk about the show Riverdale and all the Indiana Jones movies in one episode. We tried to talk about Gilmore Girls and all the X-Men movies in one episode. It was super messy in the beginning, trying to just breeze through a ton of content, and part of that was the shock value, how the heck are they supposed to connect these things? Because I wanted to be topical and talk about things that are relevant, but I also wanted to commit to the gimmick of ideas being pulled out of the jar. Anyway, I gave everyone a few questions to reflect on in terms of just reminiscing on the podcast. So what has been your favorite episode that you would have been a part of?
I think, and it's tough because I think I pretty much enjoyed every time I was there. There was never one podcast where I was like, wow, I can't wait for this to be over. I enjoyed it every time. I think 2 of the highlights for me would have been when we covered Joker and Rise of Skywalker, which both would have been in late 2019. And I think it was really cool because I think both of those movies, for different reasons, obviously, were just big movies that a lot of people were seeing and a lot of people were talking about and had very strong feelings for. So I think it was exciting for the Joker one, just knowing that so many people were seeing it, so many people were talking about it. It was really cool to get all of my thoughts out there. But then I think more so, yeah, I think my final answer will have to be the Rise of Skywalker episode because um, I really loved Force Awakens when it came out. And with each passing year that a Star Wars movie came out, and for the record, I don't hate any Star Wars movies. I love them all equally, even though some are more flawed than others. But I think Rise of Skywalker was once we had finished it and we saw it in theaters together. Average Joe, I remember seeing that in theaters with you, and as soon as it finished, it's like, okay, well, let's go back to your place to talk about the movie. And yeah, I had so many thoughts because I was really after like loving Force Awakens and liking Last Jedi, but kind of wondering like, okay, what's how are they going to finish this? I had so many thoughts, so it was really great to be able to talk about it. And then that episode was my last one as a co-host because I remember you had that, I think, Power Rangers sword or whatnot, where you kind of took the co-host abilities away from me, and it's like, whoa, where am I? What's happening? So that was also kind of cool because it was basically the start of my Christmas vacation, and we got to start it with seeing that movie, having that discussion, but then knowing that I wasn't going to be a co-host anymore because I was running out of time. But I do think all of them were a blast, but I think that one was the most exciting to try and break down episode 9, and then also just knowing that after that I didn't know the next time I was going to be on the podcast again.
That's right. I remember that. And
If you don't get to Calgary, I will forever be the co-host. You cannot remove my power.
Yeah, and we did actually. You're reminding me, Ben. We actually did that a number of times. Not just us, but I feel like especially when Jonathan and I were like living together at the beginning, we would like go see a movie, go home and record right afterwards. Like it was very, very fresh, very like raw opinions. Like not a lot of time to process before we were just getting down to discussing the nitty gritty. So yeah, that was and that movie was. I remember trying to explain all the hoops that Rise of Skywalker had to jump through with like Carrie Fisher dying and the director being replaced and responding to the response to the Last Jedi. It was like you couldn't help but feel like it was like the kid bullied on the school playground because it just had everything working against it.
Not quite as bad as The Flash, though.
No, the Flash is definitely the kid everyone's picking on.
I do remember doing that, but because I became the co-host so close to the pandemic starting, and we didn't live together, like we didn't see. Did we? Like I'm trying to think. I know we saw Sonic together, but with a bunch of other people. And you and I went to see Bumblebee together, but I can't remember if we actually watched any others like together because there were a few that we both watched individually. But I think Bumblebee is the only one where like you and I went out to see a movie together because of the podcast.
Well, and Bumblebee wasn't even. Was it because I was because you weren't on? That was that was like December 2018. So I don't know if.
I think I might have been filling in for
Maybe
that week because I maybe we just went to see it together. I thought it was for the podcast.
I think we were just being friends.
Oh, yeah.
We used to do that, like do things together.
Yes, we used to live in the same city. Well, we weren't living together still at the time.
True. Yes.
But still, it was, yeah. But that being said, I think so. I did think Sonic the Hedgehog was one that I did quite enjoy, but I also kind of enjoyed like because Pixel Patch was there and a few other people too when we went to see it. It was also I think the first episode Mjolnir was on.
Yes, that is correct.
Because you had met her when you came over to watch some Doctor Who for the Doctor Who episode.
That's right.
But it was the first time she was on the podcast. So that one has a special place in my heart. But I think, honestly, my favorite one is the D&D one where, like, everybody was so enthused about it that we managed to convince you. I mean, I don't think it took that much of convincing at that point, but I do remember you like growing more and more kind of like or less and less reticent towards it. I think rather than getting warmer, you were getting less cold. I think, but also like I think it was also something I was kind of passionate. Like it was, you know, closer to when I had started in D&D, and it was very much like my main hobby at the time. And I think I was actively in 2 or 3 campaigns. Like it was, a pretty exciting time, and I think that all of that is something I really enjoyed. We never had a 40K episode.
No, we didn't get to that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the D&D episode is special to me because I think it's the one episode of the podcast both of my brothers were on.
Oh, yeah.
And it was quite the crowd because, yeah, there was the two of us, my two brothers, and then both Pixel Patch and One Shot were all there. And you guys were all so excited about talking about D&D.
I think there was an added thing because we were all slightly trying to convince you to play too.
Yeah, I feel like I said very little in that episode. Yeah, and it's also funny to reflect, like you're talking even, Ben, about us like having to get together in person to record. Very quickly into the pandemic, I had to like find an alternative for recording virtually, and it's kind of how we've done it ever since, especially when good old Beeper moved out west.
Right.
And it ended up being a great, COVID friendly activity to just do podcasting because you could just do it from home, and was you had all this time on your hands, so it was easy to do all the extra work as well.
Yeah.
And from like an editing perspective, the episodes where you've had like 6 or 7 people, like very difficult to arrange all that. Like some of those Lord of the Rings or Tolkien episodes, or
Yep, I remember that.
even the one about the Umbrella Academy. Surprisingly, a lot of people showed up for that one. I think for me, a favorite moment will always be when Asian John just picked up his guitar and he, in the middle of the episode, decided to make a medley of like the Japanese and English Power Rangers theme songs. It was the most. I think we were talking about the fact that Power Rangers was adapted from Japanese material, and he just picked up his guitar and started playing it. And you could hear my live reaction of like, I can't believe you're doing this. It's so cool. But in terms of like a favorite episode, it's kind of hard. I think episodes I'm particularly proud of actually are like the ranking ones, where like we did one episode ranking the movie Jokers, the movie Batman, the movie Spider-Man. Yeah, like those were a lot of fun. And like doing the rankings of the comic book movies that were released each year, the rankings of the Disney movies. There was just something kind of I enjoyed, kind of like pooling all the information and then making an official decision based on considering what the people were saying, but also like what we wanted to say. Okay, second question: what are some highlights from your time as a co-host?
So I have 2, although one of them technically was not when I was a co-host, but I got to give it an honorable mention because we talked about the 2019 Oscar nominees for the year 2018, and I remember that we went through the 8 nominees, and you'd give a movie name and then say, Ben, what's this movie about? And I remember every time I was able to give a brief synopsis of what the movie is about. So I was proud of that. But there was a moment, I think, as a co-host that, I think you would still sometimes kind of challenge me or quiz me on, like, randomly we were covering Men in Black International from 2019.
Oh gosh.
And but the one thing I do remember though is that, of course, I still keep up with the box office numbers. I still watch Charts with Dan, a great YouTube channel. So I'm all about those numbers and seeing how certain movies are doing. And I remember seeing that it made like $28.5 million on its opening weekend. And I love that, of course, you just happened to mention, you're like, so Men in Black International came out this past weekend. Ben, the movie buff, do you have any idea how much it made? And I was like, $28.5 million. And I just, luckily I'd looked it up the day before, but I think it makes me feel good as a movie buff when, and also when I was your co-host, when you would ask me questions and I was pretty certain about the answers, because obviously I do not have all the time in the world to watch every single movie ever made or every single classic, but I try to kind of give the impression that, yeah, I've seen all the movies that are worth seeing. So I love being tested about it and being able to know what I'm talking about, and have a valid answer. So I always enjoyed that.
Yeah, it's been fun to see your YouTube career, if you will, kind of like run sideline like alongside this podcast, because I think
Yeah,
it was around the same time we were developing this that you were creating your Ben the
that's
Movie Buff
true.
YouTube channel.
That's right.
And I know your ability to like you have a job, so you're not a full-time YouTuber, so
Yeah.
it's like your ability to make content for that has always been in correlation to how busy you are with work. But it's been cool to like see your content continue
Mhm.
as the show has continued.
Yeah, and at least like on the bright side, because it's funny, so many times people ask me like, "Oh, you coming out with another video?" And I'm like, "Oh, I got some ideas, I'm trying." But yeah, I just find myself so busy. But the one thing that I love doing, and you'll notice it's the most common kind of video on my channel, is the end of year best movies list. Like I without fail do that, because I mean I have a list right now going on for best movies that I've seen in the year 2023, and at the end of this year I will absolutely make a video. But yeah, I do need to challenge myself to make a few other videos in the meantime. But yeah, that's right. I do remember mentioning on the podcast that I was starting that up, because I think I started that at the end of 2017. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, end of 2017 I think is when I started that.
Yeah. And I love your how you do those videos. It's just really neat. It's like movies I saw in this year. So it's like movies you saw for the first time in that
Yep.
year. It doesn't have to be a movie that was released that year. It's just like, yeah, here's a movie I saw for the first time. And I think it's a great idea. I kind of want to do that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it came out of a necessity of just because I didn't have enough time or money to see so many movies in theaters of a given year. Although, of course, with time passing on, like I could easily give you a list of like my favorite movies specifically from 2016 and 2019, because we've had enough time that I've been able to catch up on certain movies that I didn't see that year but came out from that year. So, but yeah, it's worked.
I This is a little bit strange or maybe counterproductive to the point of being nostalgic, but I have enjoyed, in a weird way, parts of why the podcast is ending. Just being co-hosts together in times of transition. I don't know if that makes sense. Like going through, but like still making it work when both our lives were changing a lot, and you know, starting with, oh, okay, we're gonna change our recording time because we're both a little bit busy, or we're having, and kind of having those compromises happen, but still, finding the time and being able to do this together, and kind of like, I think also just being able to keep in touch with you personally, but also like a little bit through the podcast too with people in Ottawa. I think it was something really important for me personally after moving out west. It was part of my connection with home was doing the podcast.
Mm.
And then like, I think also just you making me realize some of my speech patterns. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, how many times have you told me, oh, you only say yes and no, or yes but, or and it's like, I do that a lot, but it's hard to notice some of those things when you don't have somebody explicitly telling you.
I have a
And
bad habit for that. I'm always like catching up on
yeah,
things
but I
people say
think,
a lot.
but also probably, because you edit, you end up re-listening to it again, and like it's in your mind a lot more. Like I could never do that. I think I've talked about it a few times. I barely listen to the podcast because I hate the sound of my voice. But you powered through it somehow, and good for you. But I think that those are two things that were kind of highlights for me, and definitely us making it work through the pandemic, because I do remember like you did come over to my apartment once to record, and we are like, but and I remember it being so like awkward, and it's like, well, should I come, can I come, can we do this, we've both been tested, it's okay, we don't have symptoms, but probably shouldn't maybe. And then transitioning into the online, which yeah, was nice and has been able to bring in more people, which I think was a nice evolution for the podcast. I do still kind of miss, you reminding me to talk towards the microphone and like all the setup because you'd been doing it for a while and I was just starting. And yeah, because I think I'd only done the One Piece episode when I became the co-host.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was very new to it, but but I think the growing together and keeping in touch was something really big for me.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned like keeping people on mic, because before we discovered remote recording, literally anytime I had people on the podcast that couldn't make it to my place, I would literally bring the whole setup to them. So I can remember going to visit my brother in Peterborough for like the weekend, and I just brought all the podcast stuff with me, and we kind of like worked into the weekend recording a podcast. Or our friend Dee Dee, who lives out in the east end of Ottawa, I would like make a point of like going to her house for like dinner and stuff before before doing a podcast episode with her. And I'm just like, man, like all these resources for online recording existed. I'm like, I wasted so much time lugging that stuff around. Could have just made everyone's lives a lot easier.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I think when I was mentioning that Oscar nominees episode that we were talking about, we recorded that, I think, during a snowstorm at a friend's place. It wasn't your place, and Pixel Patch at the time, like he was there for the episode as well. It wasn't his place. I think his now wife, but then girlfriend, I think might have been living at that household. And I remember, like, after a day of work, kind of driving through this snowstorm, because like I got to be part of this episode tonight, because I know we're probably talking about the Oscar nominees. And yeah, but it is interesting, because even going back to the Rise of Skywalker episode, I think one of the things that was nice about it is that, as much as I love the convenience of being a part of this from the comfort of my own home, there is something kind of special about like seeing the people physically that you're actually talking to, being in that space, and doing that. It's obviously, it's not the same as um, what we've been doing since the pandemic, but it's been nice to physically get in the same space with other
The
people.
room where it happens.
Yep, exactly.
And it's funny. It's like when you were on the episode we did about the Hamilton musical, and at
Yeah,
that
that's
point
right.
I had only like researched a little bit about it, and now I can
Yeah.
say I went and saw it in Toronto this summer. I've
Oh,
actually seen a production of
lucky.
Hamilton now.
Oh, that's awesome, man. One step ahead of me. That's so cool.
And finally, this is more so like our soapbox question, but what have you seen as big changes to either your tastes in nerd or geek culture since the podcast started?
So I was thinking about this, and yeah, something I've noticed, especially since, because I'm pretty sure 2017 was the year when I first was like a guest on the podcast when we did the Nerd versus Geek episode. And since then, something I've kind of noticed, definitely about the way that I kind of consume movies and the way that I look for movies, is that back in 2016, 2017, like, yes, I was still, like, streaming was still a thing. I would still, watch stuff on Netflix and rent movies on YouTube. But I think at the time I was definitely kind of sailing the high seas, if you know what I mean, when it came to looking for certain movies. Yeah, and then also sometimes just using like third party websites, right? Like watch certain movie online free. But then it's interesting because I think, especially with the pandemic, streaming's just been getting yep, that's right, good old LimeWire. Um, I remember once the pandemic hit, that I felt like streaming obviously just became more of a necessity, because movie theaters were closed down for a while. And I think something I've been noticing that I've been doing easily for the last year and a half now, especially getting my 4K TV and having a Roku media device. So in addition to the usual big channels that you can have on there, like Disney Plus and Prime and Netflix and all that, is that they have a lot of these other free movie channels like Tubi, like Plex, and some other kind of obscure ones that once in a while I would use to find movies. So I think for me, instead of just like, oh, I've heard of this movie that I want to see, I'm just going to go download it. I'm just going to go watch it on a third party website. I've put so much effort into going onto my TV and typing in the name of the movie to see, is it available for streaming? And surprisingly, I'd say, like, most of the times it is. Sometimes you do have to pay $5 or $6 like a rental fee for it, but I would take a wild guess, and maybe other people can relate, is that with streaming, just having gotten bigger with every passing year because of the pandemic and because of the whole streaming wars. That I've put so much effort into that. And anytime I think of a movie that I want to see, I gotta check on the TV. Is it available in a app that I already have, or is it something I have to pay $5 or $6 for, or do I have to look elsewhere? But I feel like streaming has been just such a big thing that whether people like it or not has just become so convenient because and especially with all these Marvel movies, right? That would it have been cool to see Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania on the big screen? Sure, I guess. But a couple months later, it comes to Disney Plus, and I saw it, and I was like, oh, that was decent. I'm glad that I waited. So I find like that has definitely kind of changed ever since the pandemic, and also since this podcast was started.
Yeah, streaming is definitely it's too much now. Actually, I find like there's just so much. I think back to 2016, I had Netflix, and I knew Amazon Prime Video existed.
Yeah. I find I have this weird thing, I'm at this place though right now where I do watch, almost everything on streaming services, but then I'm like, but at the same time, I still have like over 400 DVDs, and it's because it's a collection of Mjolnir's DVDs and mine. We could go probably a year of consuming media that one of us hasn't seen just from DVDs, and it would probably, it would save money on the streaming service, but then there are new things that we want to be able to see and we want to be able to catch, and like you said, not in theaters anymore because that doesn't really work, and especially now that we have a baby, it's a lot harder to go out. Like, man, I think the last movie we saw was The Batman, and that was, because we were living with I think we were living, yeah, we were living with my mom at the time, so it was pretty easy or much easier for her to look after the baby. But I don't know, but there is a part of me that's still like, every once in a while I'm like, we could just cancel this for a few months and just watch DVDs, but it doesn't happen so much.
Yeah, I can actually remember. I think it might have been with you, Ben, when Disney Plus launched. We did our whole episode just like doing like a
Yes.
review of the Disney Plus app.
I
And
remember that.
what
Yep.
was on there at launch.
Hmm.
I was so jazzed that Gargoyles was on there. I still have to get to finish that. I'm in the final season though.
Yeah, actually, thankfully, because of that episode, that's actually how I got into The Mandalorian. Because I mean, I heard about it and I thought like I'm gonna watch this at some point, but it was not a priority for me at the time. And then you gave me your login info, and you're like, "Oh, just watch the first episode so we can talk about it." I'm like, "For sure." And after that first episode, I was like, "Okay, maybe I can watch it a bit sooner." And once I got my Roku Media device, probably like a month later, like I remember speaking to my family and saying, "Okay, who wants in on Netflix? Who wants in on Disney Plus?" Right? Because you split the cost, and then you get access to a lot of stuff for cheaper than if you were to just have it by yourself. So yeah, once I got the three big channels, I was like, all right, I am officially into streaming a lot now.
I think for myself, again, because I came into the podcast later, and also kind of in a later stage in my life. Like, I don't know if that makes sense, but even though there has been some pretty massive life changes that have happened to me since I started, like, as far as my tastes and how I interact with like kind of nerd and geek culture, it hasn't changed a whole lot since the podcast. But I have, before we started recording, we were talking to Average Joe about like things that did he get into some of the things that he reviewed, and you said not a lot, but it is still a byproduct of covering that many things that you discovered new things, and and I think there are a few, like, not necessarily things that are different or that I enjoy more, but there are a few things that I definitely watch for the podcast that later I was like, oh, so like what Ben the movie buff said about the Mandalorian, I watched like, I think I watched all of Andor in like 2 days, and then immediately was told my wife, "Oh, we need to watch this together because it was actually pretty great." And and I think so. I guess kind of broadening my horizons has helped me interact with more things. But as far as like my tastes and what I like and what I dislike, it hasn't changed that much.
Yeah, you've been pretty consistent. You had Marvel fatigue when you started, and you still have
That's
Marvel
true.
fatigue.
Oh yeah, maybe that's what it is. It's just yeah, I've had Marvel fatigue for a long time. What can I say? It's but I think also I was never, I don't know, as much into the superhero. Like I think it is partially though because because I wasn't into a lot of things that are mainstream geeky when I was a kid. It means that a lot of the I have less nostalgia for a lot of those things. So a lot of what I've developed as a taste for geek and nerd culture, I've done as an adult or a young adult. So I think that kind of informs the fact that I don't change as much, except for a couple of new fandoms that I really got into, like Warhammer and D&D. But you know that's because even anime, I started watching anime in grade 12 properly. Like I had seen episodes of Pokemon, and I loved Pokemon the first movie, but that was it.
And here we are on at the time of our recording. It's just before the live action One Piece show begins airing on Netflix.
Oh, I still don't know how to feel about that.
Ichiro Oda himself has praised the show, so surely you can trust him.
I mean, probably, yeah, but eh, maybe that's the big change. I've less time to be as much into fandoms as I used to.
One thing I've seen pop up over and over again since we've been doing this podcast is the power of fans. Fans seem to really have, and obviously this is because of social media, have way more influence over what gets made than I think they ever have. I can remember uh, Young Justice was canceled in 2013, and at the time of the start of the podcast, I was like, "This is one of the best shows ever," and it got canceled because it wasn't selling toys. And then when DC was announcing its streaming service, they announced they were bringing back Young Justice, and I remember being all excited and talking about it and trying to convince everyone I could stare at um, to watch the show on Netflix so that it would bump up its numbers and to buy the merch. I literally bought a PS3 game they made for Young Justice, even though I didn't own a PS3, because I wanted to like show Warner Brothers that I supported Young Justice. And then of course we have like Sonic the Hedgehog, the movie. Like they delayed the movie several months and completely redesigned the main character because of the reaction fans had. We have things like the Snyder Cut that came into existence uh, for better or for worse. And now it's especially unfortunate with DC movies, but there's this real division in the fandom. People love the Snyderverse and they just won't shut up about it.
Yeah, but it didn't necessarily trigger, a lot. I remember when we did the episode, we talked about like, will directors re-release or recut shows, and like, is it going to become the new standard? Doesn't seem to have been, so I'm happy about that at least.
Yeah, and it kind of honestly scares me as we like look to the future. I think nerd and geek culture in a very interesting point as we are wrapping up this podcast. There's a writers and actors strike going on in Hollywood, so nothing's being made there. I think the MCU is floundering right now. I think DC is trying to reboot themselves, but there's clearly a declining interest in their movies. It feels like, at least when you look at the superhero stuff, everyone's trying to reorient themselves. And I think we are actually seeing like the end of the dominance of superhero media.
Yeah, but I think it's a very interesting time for nerd and geek culture, and probably a good time. Like, there is the kind of negative aspect of the internet, and specifically um, what has happened because of the big shutdown and the pandemic, there's been very uh, big trend of polarization, intentional polarization of many things. But there has also been kind of a lot of, I think, I think a lot of the seeds that have led to, the writer's strike and the actors actually going in has been about kind of being sick of always being served the same thing over and over again, right? Like Marvel fatigue evolved into superhero fatigue, and it's not just it's not just movies. Like if you look at the massive debacle around the D&D trying to change their open license, and it there's other examples too, but of like these big companies that used to dominate everything that are now being challenged. Like there are at least 3 or 4 independent tabletop RPGs that are being released by very popular people who used to do D&D but that are now their direct competition. And I think also when we come out of the writers strike, there, even if the big studios end up settling because they have the money to do it, I do think that smaller productions that are led more by the artists that rather than studios are going to come back up. Indie movies are going to make a bit of a resurgence, if nothing else, out of necessity. And I think a lot of that is going to change. And instead of having just the big fandoms, it's going to create a lot more nuance in what we get as media. And the widespread and kind of acceptance of nerd and geek culture has gone up even since we began the podcast, right? And definitely since any of us, when we were young, a lot of those things were very niche, but like nobody would look at it. And now it's like considered to be normal. So I think it's a nice time of change, and I think it's something that I'm hopeful about, that it will kind of flourish into kind of a lot of stuff. And it might not all be super popular, might not all be very good, but a lot more diversity in what you can enjoy as media and as content, I think, is a good thing. And also, I think, in a way, is kind of the solution to hyperpolarization, is just having so many things that you can't have an opinion on everything. So you do interact with things that are more nuanced or things that are different and enjoy them as such.
Yeah, I've just had to accept I can't keep up with everything anymore. Like I have to literally just pick and
Mm-hmm.
choose
Yeah,
the
that too.
movies and the shows I'm gonna watch because I just don't. There's just too much content, and
And such a big back catalog too.
yeah, like I watched the first 15 minutes of Secret Invasion and I was like, nope. Whereas like when those shows first started with like WandaVision, and I was hooked. It's like I wanted to see every single episode. And Beeper, or not Beeper, Ben the movie buff,
Yes.
any thoughts on the the evolution of fan culture? Like, do you see an end to these strikes as a movie expert?
Oh, geez. I think there's definitely going to be an end, but I do think, from what I've heard, I've been partially keeping up with the strikes and negotiations and whatnot. Um, there was some anonymous producer mentioned that the end goal here was to keep the strike going on long enough so that the people that are striking would lose their apartments, lose their homes, run out of money, and that they would have to, out of desperation, sign a negotiation that is not ideal to them, but in favor of the producers to get things back on track. I don't know 100% sure if that's going to happen or not, but I could see both parties playing the long game to get their way. Um, and yeah, so I think there's definitely an end. I don't know if it's going to be as quickly resolved as past strikes. Um, like the one that happened in 2007, and I think there was one in the 80s. So, yeah, it is a strange time for sure because, in a sense, we are kind of getting a bit of a repeat with what happened when the pandemic became a thing. Because for a couple months, I mean, nothing was being made. Like we were still getting, like I remember, Extraction came out on Netflix during the pandemic, but of course, that was a movie that had already been shot and was probably just finishing post production. So I think, we seem to be getting, or I think soon we might start feeling that ripple effect of the fact that with these strikes going on, if nothing's been resolved yet, that there'll be a time where certain movies like Dune Part 2 got delayed, and I feel like other movies might also, Beyond the Spider-Verse. There's also a movie that we thought we were getting in March of next year, which I was so excited for, but it sounds like that got postponed indefinitely. Yeah, exactly. So that's a little nerve-wracking. So there might be, I think, a bit of this repetition where, these movies that we thought we were so close to are now a lot farther away with this strike going on. So
And they had just put out the photo of Hugh Jackman in his comic book accurate
yeah,
yellow
with
Wolverine costume,
Deadpool. Oh my goodness.
and who knows when that we'll see that now.
Yep.
But yeah, that's another big evolution as like technology, and that seems to be at the root of a lot of these strikes is like rights for streaming services and when is it okay to use a digital double of a person. So there is no clear answer to those things for me. But just to bring it back to what Beeper was saying, it's like, yeah, nerd and geek culture is mainstream, and it's a
Yes.
great way to kind of bring it back to the beginning. This podcast got its name because of the Big Bang Theory TV show.
Mhm.
In like the first season of that show, there was an episode where Sheldon and Leonard start arguing about this Batman cookie jar they owned. And I had never thought that one could even own a Batman cookie jar before that episode of TV came on. But as soon as I saw it, I wanted one, and I ended up getting 2 bat jars. Actually, the first one actually broke before an episode of the Bat Jar podcast, and now it's pretty normal for me to see people out in public wearing superhero T-shirts or even anime T-shirts now. It's not nearly as hidden a thing as it might have been when we were younger. So, yeah, as we look to the future, it's it's as they say in Back to the Future Part 3. Your future has been written yet. No one's has. The future is what you make of it. So make it a good one. And
I prefer the future is not set from Terminator 2, except then the series totally messed it up.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Yeah.
So with that being said, thank you, Ben and Beeper, for having been here today to mark this final episode and to have been on the journey with me, and to everyone else that we found time for in this episode. Hopefully we were able to get everybody in, but I'm recording in the past, so I actually don't know.
Yep, and you're so welcome, Average Joe. I wanted to take a minute to obviously thank you because, and I suppose you and Asian John for kind of getting this started and for you to keep this going. Um, so many times in my life, especially someone who likes working on creative projects and has a million idea for movies, but of course, like I've made a handful. Um, that I think it's easy for people to talk about cool things that they want to do, but it's another thing to actually get out there and do it and make it something that you can share with people. And yeah, it's so cool that you were able to do it, and the fact that you've kept doing it, and that I was thinking of a handful of the episodes that I did with you, and then you would bring up like, oh, Disney Plus and this and that, and I would go, oh, right, I almost forgot about that, but then just saying that brought me back. And I know that there are so many people that have listened to this podcast and have had the pleasure of being able to listen to it for nearly 7 years now because you've kept it going. So I think on behalf of everyone who's listened to the Backjar podcast and everyone who's been a part of it, thank you for keeping this going, because yeah, it really does feel like the end of an era.
Yeah, and to add to that a little bit, although I think Ben was very eloquent in that, so I won't put too much. But for me personally, you've been very patient with me as a co-host, and obviously circumstances were strange and ever changing when we were doing it together. But I still really appreciate what you've done, and even just that you thought of me as being one of the co-hosts. Especially following up, on Ben the Movie Buff and Pixel Patch, I do not have the near the level of knowledge and expertise that they do. So it was very humbling for me to do, but I enjoyed all of it.
Yeah, it feels weird. Like I don't want to. Part of me doesn't want to like wrap up this episode because I know that means this is it. But as I've mentioned on the show before, there are many reasons why this is the time for the Batch Hour podcast to come to its conclusion. My brother Dan Hatton, he created a Canadian rugby podcast that became far more successful than this ever was. And it was incredible for me to see that's the secret to podcasting is find a niche topic which will naturally draw the interest of everyone who's already interested in it. And then you'll get people who aren't already interested kind of like checking in and being like, oh, I wonder what this is about. And truth be told, I was just trying to create my version of the Weekly Planet when the Weekly Planet already exists.
Yeah, but but you had a fresh perspective. You have a different but I think it also doesn't help that a lot of other people are also trying to be the Weekly Planet because they're big, because they're successful, right? But if you get the idea for a new podcast, even if it's more niche, or if you need someone who doesn't know too much about something, keep me in mind. We'll talk more, but
Totally.
obviously, probably not soon, but at some point, because I think you're very good at this. You need to give
Absolutely.
yourself credit for planning, organizing, coordinating people. Like you've put a lot of work into this.
And also initiating a discussion, right? Like so many times, we do the podcast together, and I'd always be curious, like, what's this discussion gonna be like, especially if we like disagree on a movie, or especially like the one I think it was either we did an episode about Lost or Battlestar Galactica, or maybe both. And I think those were shows that I had both watched in full and you'd only known a little bit about. And yeah, I always appreciated how good you were at keeping the conversation going, and like, oh, spending more time on something that we're all really getting into or moving on to something else. And yeah, because I know sometimes it's so easy to ramble and take 30 minutes to talk about like one aspect of something, but I felt like you did a good job of trying to touch base on the things that people would likely want to hear. So yeah, I always appreciated that quality in you, Average Joe.
Thank you.
And you kept it accessible.
Yes, 100%.
No inside
Which
baseball.
honestly, with a nerd and geek culture podcast, is a good thing, and not an easy feat always.
Thanks, guys. Well, on that note, there's no point in telling people to send us emails or
Yeah.
whatever. It's the end.
They will go into the void of the internet.
Yes.
Mhm.
As I said at the beginning, we'll keep the show live on the internet for a few months, and then we'll be shutting off our hosting. So yeah, if you do want to, I'm not just saying this to increase our numbers, but download episodes you want to keep, and then that will be the end. So there is no next time. So for the final time, I'm Average Joe, or Joseph Murphy, as everyone knows who I am. This is no surprise. I post this publicly on my Facebook page. I've just never like officially like referred to myself by my actual name. But yeah, catch you on the flip side.
See you in the next one. Or actually, no, I can't even say that. See you maybe never.
And I will never have a real catchphrase.
Yeah.